I might as well have asked the question, Sir Hilary, does it mean that I'm born in Africa, that I'm decolonized? Does it mean that I'm an African 5, 6, 8 generations later, now living in Barbados, that I am decolonized? And I suggest that, or put differently, the fact that we've got a decolonization momentum here in South Africa, by way of example, does it mean that an academic can tomorrow suddenly be decolonized and can offer a far more dense and complex episteme? Is it possible for us suddenly to wake up one morning and we are cleansed of these 4 centuries of deception and duplicity? I suggest not. I suggest that we need a methodological approach to work ourselves out of that situation. And I offer us 6 ideas or 6 steps in that process. The first of this, first I suggest, is what I call the activation of individual and social agency, in contrast to assimilation and mimicry. Assimilation and mimicry, I love this word, mimicry. So, activation of individual and social agency, in contrast to assimilation and mimicry in the intellectual and social landscape. This commences with self-awareness. That's the starting point. Self-awareness, which leads to self-conscious behavior and human agency. I think that's a fundamental step on this journey. We don't just wake up one morning and we offer a new set of insights into the stuff we've been teaching for the last 30 years. I believe this is the essential process of becoming, the purpose of which is to reignite or reconnect with one's source of existence, and which is the process of becoming an unapologetic and confident global African. So I leave that idea with us, the importance of agency in the context of assimilation and mimicry. But it begins with self-awareness and leads to self-conscious behavior and human agency. The second idea or process that I offer us is the idea to re-engage then critically and discursively with Western hegemonic philosophy, thought, science, and historicism, including its language and even its tonality. I say that tongue-in-cheek, that we so easily assimilate and mimic, often even better than the Westerner. This process involves reflecting on and deconstructing socially constructed and embedded Western hegemonic myths. So it's a conscious process. This process can benefit, I believe, immensely from the thoughts and reflections of Gramsci, even as he considers the social construction or the socially constructed Western hegemonic building processes in Europe after World War I, and from Bourdieu, Foucault, and of course our African scholar Derrida, as they seek to deconstruct Western cultural myths, and from other Marxists, of course, and other social constructivists, neo-Marxists, postmodern, and liberation movement theories. So I suggest that the first step can't be to re-engage with Western hegemonic thought and science, and so on. The first step is agency, awareness, alertness, reading critically, discursing critically. It is then that we need to go back to Western hegemonic myths. Okay, let me be more generous. Western hegemonic philosophy, thought, science, and historicism. It seems the third step or third part of this process is to separate out and then delink what is myth from that which is substance. I think that is somewhat self-explanatory, but it's an important step. It's a process in which we now separate out and de-link myth. The fourth step I suggest, or fourth part, is then to re-engage critically and discursively with dismissed, suppressed, and denigrated global African philosophies, science, and historicity, and authentically to rehistoricize global Africa and its philosophies and science, while separating out and again delinking myth from fact. In this process, one reaffirms self as global African, and thus we forge a global African identity. Fifth step, I suggest, drawing on Nkrumah, on Garvey, on Mazrui, on Said, Mamdani, Biko, Cabral, Fanon, Walcott, Rodney, and others, engage first in the process of counter-penetration, a dialogue of Western and global African philosophies, sciences, and historicism. You can't jump to this stage, I argue, Sir Hilary. You can't jump to this stage without the previous steps or stages in the process of becoming. And then sixth, finally, having engaged these ideas across West-East African, engage synthesis. Important distinction, not assimilation. Engage synthesis. It's easy to confuse assimilation with synthesis. And so engage synthesis, or what Tad Metz here at UJ calls a dialogue of mutual enrichment. Such avoids the seductive dual traps of what Cross and Firepi calls insularity, the process of looking inward only, or what is elsewhere called negritude or Afrocentrism. And on the other hand, it avoids the other trap, which is universalism or global universalism, in which there is no global African philosophy, science, and historicity to contribute to world civilization. I suggest that it's when we undertake this methodological and intellectual journey that we will far more comfortably and confidently teach characteristically global African perspectives and approaches, and expose our students to texts written by global Africans, teach in music departments indigenous music forms, teach in philosophy departments the works of great global African thinkers, seriously study in sociology departments African societies, explore in our history departments unknowns about the ancient and near past of global Africa, demonstrate a global African approach to engineering and mathematics, such as turning abstract concepts to work in designing something that would benefit a village, a township. We would seriously then explore in our psychology departments relational concepts of self and holistic comprehensions of the world more prominent in Africa than in the West. Engage in political theory with global African conceptions of democracy. Devote significant time in journalism classes to address the obligations of what an Ubuntu ethic might entail for reporters or others in the publishing industry, and seriously examine the efficacious roles of herbal and traditional medicines in our science departments, just by way of example. You see, Sir Hilary and colleagues, this methodological approach offers a fundamental departure from the default and what I call the primitive idea of decolonization, namely, let us simply contextualize or provide local examples, that leaves the underlying Western philosophy, historicity, and science completely in place, untouched. And so our default is under pressure, right? Step into the class tomorrow and we give local examples, and that's decolonization. Can't be, can't be, can't be. And so, and it seems to me that the methodological approach that I offer here is also vitally important for the coming from naive innocence of our mainstream and other good-intentioned academics and others, such as members of the Fourth Estate. So we have to enable these colleagues with good intentions to first say, hey, I can't just do this, you know. I've got to do my homework. I've got to go through a process of becoming. When I wrote these notes, I said we need re-education, and then I scrapped it. I said that's not what we do in academia, but nonetheless, it seems we have to find an appropriate word, a pragmatic word, to describe this process of becoming, of moving from naive innocence in some instances to becoming a true global African scholar. We may then also confidently name and rename our facilities and institutions, such as Rhodes University. Okay, I can say because I'm an alumnus of Rhodes University. Yeah. To reflect our global Africa historicity. And as Professor Adebayo holds, he believes, wear our dashikis and other global African attire with confidence, thus reflecting and affirming our global African identity. And it's in these manners that we'll be able to recontextualize abstract knowledge that are at present largely informed by modernist theories of knowing. So what then is our motive? I believe that it is drawing on global Africa's philosophy, sciences, and historicity. It is to advance civilization and humanity. It's also to nurture and affirm the evolving identity of the global African, as it is to remedy the misdeeds of the past. Inspired by Dakar, Ibadan, and the Dar es Salaam schools, we continue this journey of nurturing the movement of emancipation and of creating the inclusive, caring, decolonized, and sustainable future through the making of a new intellectual movement, the strength of which lies in its commitment to set a new direction for the course of the meaning of global Africa and the affirmation of the global African identity, and simultaneously so to the causes of knowledge production and higher education institution building in global Africa. That is the task of the New Johannesburg School that we give life to this very special June 16 weekend of 2017. I skip parts of my paper because of time and try and rush quickly to the end. So, this then logically leads me back to the question. When all is said and done, what will be global Africa's contribution to global Africa and to the world as global Africans take leadership of the world? I believe it must be to strive to live the Ubuntu traits, which I have not been able to elaborate, but is in the paper, of human solidarity, and of kindness, of sympathy, of compassion, of benevolence, of altruism, of sacrifice, and of mercy. It must be the return to the other global Africa ethic, which is to live in harmony with our planet, and which now requires fundamental and urgent recalibration. I believe our contribution will also be when contextualized undergraduate studies, voluntary community service, and service learning challenge and enable our students to make poverty and inequality history, and enable them to lead the world in their enterprises, in their organizations and public institutions to a far better place, inclusive, caring, and sustainable. And so I conclude where I began with Said and Mazrui by offering us Said's seminal reminder of intellectuals' historic duty. It reminds us that the role of the intellectual cannot be played without a sense of being someone whose place it is publicly to raise embarrassing questions, to confront orthodoxy and dogma rather than to reproduce them, to be someone who cannot easily be co-opted by governments or corporations. It's not saying anything about Guptas here. And whose raison d'etre is to represent all those people and issues that are routinely forgotten or swept under the carpet. For when we do all of this, it is then, I believe, that we shall return to source and to relinking with Nkrumah, with Garvey, with Cabral, with Fanon, with Walcott, with Rodney, with Biko. And when we can finish, or at least initiate, the finishing of the unfinished business of decolonization and of reimagining and creating a new future for global Africa and for the world. I thank you.
That Professor Rensburg spoke like a vice chancellor. He was clear, precise, methodical, and he landed perfectly. A 6-point plan, the root of consciousness and the emergence of the global African citizen, decolonized and prepared for the future, but with fundamental obligations to self, to work through that process, through internal reflection and through public agency. The clarity, I think, is quite remarkable. And now it is for you to engage him in further clarification, and the floor is now open. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chancellor, for a brilliant presentation. But I think there is a missing link. And that missing link is the ability of the other, the West, to strike back and prevent us doing what we want to do. So I think what we need to do then, how do we now confront? Let me give 1 or 2 examples. The Ibadan school, the Dar es Salaam school. There was a strong push from the foundations in the West to prevent the emergence of a challenge, an Afrocentric challenge to their hegemony in terms of the global knowledge industry. And they succeeded in doing that using the big multilaterals and local proxies to prevent the emergence, and that was what killed the Dar School and the Ibadan School, in terms also co-optation. So I think the challenge is not that we know what we want to do in terms of moving ahead, but the other side is going to prevent that happening because it will undermine their continued control of our minds. And I think in fighting back, a second missing link is that we talk of African knowledge base, and yet as intellectuals, there is that divide between us and our peoples, who should also constitute the bulk of our support. Again, attempts to do that, Claude Aki at the University of Port Harcourt, and I think that in Tanzania also, undergraduates were required as part of their graduation process to go and live among the people and experience the lived experience of these people. Then external forces, again, working with proxies, internal proxies, kill those ideas. So I think the critical point then is, how do we confront this outside power that wants to maintain this hegemony? And it is a strong, strong, strong battle. So I think the ideas are already there, and there's been some success, but the point is, how do we confront this behemoth?
One word The one word that troubled me, and I would like you to sort of maybe elaborate, was your use of the word civilization. And in some way, I think it relates to the previous question. That's what troubled me about it.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. And then the gentleman here.
My name is Nikiwe. I think I just want to, I just had a lot of interesting things that have been presented, which actually touch on most of the things that I really want to comment on and also pose some questions. I think as Africans, we are very gifted in three key things, which is spirituality, traditional healing, and regality. And the Department of Health has admitted, I sometimes hear from the radio, some MECs admitting that we have diseases that cannot be cured by Western medicine. Some are spiritual, and you, Professor, has also mentioned that there's the traditional medicine, the role that it can play, and also in terms of integration with science and technology and producing the medicine. So my problem is that sometimes when you hear some doctors talking about traditional medicine, they will talk about it being, talking about hygiene, talking about toxics, talking about dangerous chemicals and so on, as if it's something bad to just take a medicine and use it at home, while even the Western medicine have got side effects. And also we do have a lot of threats in terms of the role played by royalties or traditional leaders. I don't think that there has been